Iran has test-fired missiles so many times over the past 2 years that most of the world has stopped paying attention. Another launch, another state television broadcast, another claim of a successful strike on a target hundreds of kilometers away. The same script repeated so often it barely registers as news anymore. But the most recent test broke that pattern in a way defense analysts are still trying to fully process. This time, the missile wasn't fired toward a target inside Iran or toward the usual test ranges in the country's interior. It was fired toward Siberia, with Russia's approval, and if Iran's own claims about it are accurate, it represents the first real evidence that Tehran has finally crossed a threshold. Western intelligence agencies have been warning about for years the ability to strike the continental United States directly. You would expect a missile test this significant to come with the kind of overwhelming, unambiguous proof governments usually provide when they want the world to believe them. Instead, what actually exists is a single video, posted first not by Iran's military but by an Iranian professor on social media, showing an airborne projectile arcing through clouds, nothing more. No launch site confirmation independently verified by outside satellite imagery at the time. No trajectory data released, no debris field or splashdown confirmation anywhere close to the claimed target zone. Just a video, a claim, and a regime with every incentive imaginable to make the world believe this particular test succeeded, whether or not it actually did. Before we go further, you need to understand exactly what Iran claims happened, because the specifics matter enormously here. According to regime-controlled outlets, the missile was launched from an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps base near the city of Semnan, fired in the direction of Siberia with the Russian government's approval, a detail worth sitting with on its own. The claimed target lay roughly 3,700 miles away, and Iranian state media went further, claiming the underlying missile system is capable of traveling up to 6,200 miles if fired on a different trajectory, a range that would put major American cities well within reach for the first time in this program's history. Let's talk about the timing of this test, because timing in this specific conflict has never been an accident. The claim emerged at a moment when President of America had publicly indicated that a fresh American strike on Iran remained firmly on the table. Analysts studying the pattern described this as a familiar Iranian playbook, demonstrating a dramatic new capability, real or exaggerated, specifically to complicate an adversary's calculus before a potential strike, raising the perceived cost of military action by suggesting Iran now has the ability to respond in kind against the American homeland itself, rather than simply against regional targets, as it has throughout this war so far. Now, let's talk about what Western intelligence actually believes about Iran's trajectory toward this exact capability, because the assessment here is more nuanced and more unsettling than either a flat dismissal or a flat confirmation would suggest. The Defense Intelligence Agency concluded earlier this year that although Iran has not yet fielded an operational long-range intercontinental ballistic missile, the country is rapidly approaching that benchmark and could possess as many as 60 such missiles by 2035, a stockpile that would exceed North Korea's current arsenal. That assessment predates this specific test, meaning American intelligence was already tracking Iran's trajectory toward this exact capability before this launch happened, treating it not as a distant theoretical concern, but as a near-term planning assumption. Let's put that assessment in even sharper context, because the DIA's specific language matters. The agency noted that the majority of missile systems posing a genuine threat to the American homeland have nuclear-capable variants, technology Iran has both tested independently and imported through illicit trade relationships with North Korea, Russia, and other allied countries. That's not a claim about a single missile test. That's an assessment about an entire technology transfer network that has been quietly feeding Iran's longer-range ambitions for years, using the country's civilian space program as one of its primary points of cover, a strategy Iran has employed since at least 2004, spending upwards of $1 billion on the underlying project, according to independent research groups tracking the program. Let's talk about what solid fuel missile technology specifically means for how quickly Iran could actually use a capability like this, because the fuel type matters far more than most casual coverage of missile tests ever explains. Liquid-fueled missiles, the older technology, generally require extended fueling procedures immediately before launch, procedures that create a visible, time-consuming vulnerability window during which satellites and reconnaissance aircraft can detect launch preparations well in advance. Solid fuel missiles, by contrast, can be stored fully fueled and launched on comparatively short notice, dramatically compressing the warning time available to any potential target. Iran's shift toward solid fuel systems across its more recent missile programs, including the Qasem Basir and its claimed long-range designs, represents a deliberate technical choice specifically aimed at reducing exactly this kind of strategic warning time, making any future launch, whether regional or genuinely intercontinental, far harder to detect and respond to before the missile is already airborne. Here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, because this isn't actually the first time Iran has made a claim like this, and the previous attempt didn't go nearly as well. An earlier long-range test attempt in September of last year failed outright. Analysts studying that failure point out something important. Even an unsuccessful launch still advances a country's underlying technical knowledge, meaning every attempt, successful or not, Iran makes at this specific capability moves the broader program forward incrementally, regardless of whether any individual test achieves its stated objective. That's precisely why intelligence agencies treat the pattern of repeated attempts as more significant than the outcome of any single test, successful or failed. Let's talk about the role Iran's civilian space program has played in advancing exactly this capability, because the overlap between space launch vehicles and long-range missile technology isn't a coincidence. It's a well-understood, deliberate strategy. A satellite launch vehicle and an intercontinental ballistic missile share nearly identical core technology, multi-stage solid or liquid propulsion, precision guidance systems, and re-entry vehicle engineering, differing primarily in payload and specific trajectory rather than in the underlying physics or engineering challenge. Iran has used its declared space ambitions as a legal, internationally tolerated cover for developing exactly the propulsion and staging technology a genuine ICBM program requires. A strategy analysts note the country has employed consistently since at least 2004. Every successful satellite launch Iran conducts, framed publicly as peaceful scientific progress, simultaneously demonstrates and refines technology directly transferable to a weapons delivery system, which is precisely why arms control experts have never treated Iran's space program as separate from its missile ambitions, regardless of how the two are officially described in state media. Let's widen the lens and look at Iran's broader missile development trajectory over just the past year, because this specific test doesn't exist in isolation. Reports emerged in November of last year that Iran's newest intercontinental ballistic missile was, according to unnamed defense sources cited by state-affiliated media, almost ready for service, with a claimed range of 10,000 kilometers. A figure that, if accurate, would extend Iranian strike capability across Europe and into North America, including the American mainland. Then, just months later, an Iranian lawmaker separately claimed a successful test of an intercontinental missile after videos circulated online showing smoke trails arcing upward into the sky, footage strikingly similar in its vagueness to what would later circulate around the Siberia-directed test. This isn't a single dramatic breakthrough. It's a pattern of escalating claims, each one difficult to independently verify, each one arriving at politically convenient moments, each one nudging the public narrative closer to the idea that Iran has already crossed a line intelligence agencies have long treated as still years away. Let's talk specifically about the North Korean connection referenced in Western intelligence assessments, because it's one of the more concrete, verifiable threads running through this entire story. Earlier reporting indicated Iran was developing a ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, with a range of up to 3,000 kilometers, based directly on North Korean designs. That's a significant detail, because North Korea's own long-range missile program, having already crossed the exact threshold Iran is now approaching, represents a proven, battle-tested technical template Iran can draw on directly, rather than having to independently solve every engineering challenge from scratch. Intelligence agencies have long tracked technical exchanges between Iranian and North Korean missile engineers, and any design lineage traceable back to Pyongyang's own confirmed ICBM technology would represent a considerably faster, more reliable path to genuine long-range capability than Iran attempting to develop equivalent technology entirely on its own. Now let's talk about the specific missile that actually did demonstrate a verified, meaningfully different capability, because it's easy to lose track of Iran's genuine technical progress amid all the unverified long-range claims. Back in the spring of last year, Iran's defense minister unveiled what state television called the Qasem Basir, a solid-fueled ballistic missile with a far more modest range of roughly 1,200 kilometers, but with one critical difference from everything Iran had fielded before. This was the first known use of an optical homing guidance system on a medium-range ballistic missile, technology previously reserved for Iran's shorter-range weapons. During its testing on April 17th, the missile successfully identified and struck a target more than 1,200 kilometers away, and Iranian officials claimed the system was specifically designed to penetrate advanced missile defenses, including American-made THAAD and Patriot systems, as well as Israeli defensive networks. Let's talk about exactly why that specific technical detail matters more than the flashier long-range claims, because it represents something intelligence analysts take far more seriously than an unverified Siberia launch. Iran's defense minister explicitly stated that the Qasem Basir's improved maneuverability was developed by directly addressing weaknesses exposed during 2 previous Iranian missile operations against Israel, incorporating real combat lessons into the next generation of hardware. That's a fundamentally different kind of development than a symbolic long-range test meant to intimidate. It's iterative, evidence-based weapons engineering, the kind of steady, incremental improvement that historically produces far more dangerous long-term outcomes than a single dramatic, unverifiable headline ever could. Let's also examine what this new precision guidance breakthrough means for the broader regional missile defense picture we've covered extensively in previous coverage of this conflict. Every layered air defense system, from American THAAD batteries to Israelis' multi-tier network, is fundamentally built around predicting an incoming ballistic missile's trajectory based on its initial launch parameters, then positioning interceptors to meet that predicted flight path. An optically guided missile, capable of adjusting its trajectory mid-flight, reacting in real time to what its guidance system actually observes, rather than following a purely precalculated ballistic arc, breaks that fundamental predictive assumption at the core of nearly every modern missile defense architecture. That's precisely why defense analysts treat the verified Qasem Basir technology as considerably more strategically significant than the flashier, unverified long-range claims. Because it doesn't just extend Iran's reach, it potentially undermines the basic interception math that has, so far, kept the vast majority of Iranian missiles from reaching their intended targets throughout this entire war. And there's real evidence this specific technology already worked in actual combat conditions, not just on a test range. Following an unidentified Iranian missile strike near Ben Gurion Airport outside Tel Aviv, Israeli military officials confirmed the missile had landed in the airport's vicinity after what they described as several attempts to intercept it, with the ultimate effectiveness of those interception attempts still under review at the time. Multiple other missile launches from Yemen were reported in the same period, but analysts specifically flagged this one strike as relatively successful compared to the others, precisely the kind of outcome the optical guidance system was designed to produce. A missile that can reportedly survive several genuine interception attempts against some of the most advanced air defense technology in the world represents a far more concrete, verifiable warning sign than any single unconfirmed long-range test toward Siberia. Let's put some real numbers in front of you about the broader state of Iran's missile arsenal, because the scale here provides essential context for how seriously to weigh any single new test. Before the 12-day war in June of last year, Iran possessed an arsenal estimated at roughly 2,500 to 3,000 ballistic missiles of varying ranges, supported by an estimated 300 to 400 transporter erector launchers. After that war, both numbers were roughly cut in half, leaving an estimated stockpile of 1,300 to 1,500 missiles and a launcher count somewhere between 150 and 200. That's the backdrop against which every new test claim has to be measured. If this isn't a program operating at full strength, testing new capabilities from a position of comfortable surplus, it's a program that lost roughly half its total inventory in a single war, now working to simultaneously rebuild its destroyed production capacity, while also trying to demonstrate genuinely new, more dangerous capabilities to a world watching for any sign of weakness. Let's talk about how Iran has actually managed to keep developing new systems despite that devastating loss, because the rebuilding effort itself tells its own story. American officials have stated that prior to the setbacks of this war, Iran was producing roughly 100 missiles per month, and reports indicate the country has taken concrete steps toward rebuilding its damaged production facilities since the fighting eased. That production capacity, even partially restored, represents the industrial base underneath every new test claim we're discussing tonight. A country that can still manufacture missiles at meaningful scale, even after losing half its stockpile and significant production infrastructure, retains a fundamentally different kind of long-term threat profile than one that's genuinely been reduced to symbolic gestures and unverifiable propaganda alone. Let's talk about the international legal dimension sitting underneath every one of these tests, because Iran isn't simply violating the spirit of non-proliferation norms in some abstract sense. It's operating in direct, repeated defiance of specific, binding international obligations. United Nations Security Council. Resolution 2231 explicitly calls on Iran to refrain from any activity related to ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons, a restriction Iran has treated as functionally unenforceable for years, testing increasingly capable systems while maintaining its now familiar public position that its program serves purely defensive, non-nuclear purposes. Iran's own foreign minister has previously stated that the country deliberately limits its missile range to 2,000 kilometers, a claim seemingly at odds with the program simultaneously pursuing intercontinental range capability, a contradiction that itself deserves scrutiny. Either the stated policy of self-imposed range limits has quietly changed without public acknowledgement, or programs like the Siberia Directed Test and the claimed 10,000-kilometer system represent research and development efforts explicitly outside whatever policy limit Iranian diplomats continue citing to international audiences. Now, it would be irresponsible not to give you the other side of this, because the arms control community studying Iran's missile program overwhelmingly urges caution before treating any single test claim, especially an unverified one like the Siberia launch, as evidence of a fundamental capability shift. Independent analysts have explicitly stated that despite Iran testing missiles and announcing several modest new system capabilities over the past several months, none of those individual announcements constitutes a significant enough advancement to render the missile program an imminent threat on its own. Iran has a well-documented history stretching back decades of announcing capabilities that either never materialize into fielded operational systems or that turn out, upon closer independent scrutiny, to be considerably more limited than the initial state media claims suggested. Let's talk about how American sanctions policy has or hasn't actually kept pace with this specific threat, because the enforcement record here has drawn real criticism, even from analysts otherwise sympathetic to a tough posture on Iran. Reports examining the administration's response throughout much of last year found that only 2 rounds of sanctions had been levied specifically against Iran's ballistic missile propellant and technology procurement networks, despite mounting evidence of the program's continued advancement. It also remained unclear whether reporting requirements written into legislation specifically meant to counter Iranian missile proliferation were being fully met. That gap between the scale of the assessed threat, a country the DIA believes is rapidly approaching genuine ICBM capability, and the pace of the specific sanctions tools meant to slow that exact progress, is itself a detail worth sitting with, regardless of how any individual missile test ultimately gets verified. There's also a documented pattern of outright fabricated or misidentified footage specifically surrounding Iranian missile claims, worth understanding in detail here. Just weeks before this Siberia test claim emerged, a viral video circulated on social media claiming to show Iran testing a new intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching the United States, framed explicitly as a message directed at Washington and its allies. Independent fact-checkers investigating the footage determined it actually showed something else entirely. A Chinese Gravity 1 rocket launching into space, footage from an entirely unrelated program, misattributed to Iran and spread rapidly before anyone had verified its actual source. That specific episode matters enormously for how skeptically to approach the Siberia claim, because it demonstrates just how easily unverified footage, once stripped of context and pushed through social media by accounts with their own agendas, can create the appearance of a dramatic new Iranian capability that doesn't actually exist at all. But here's where that appropriate skepticism runs into its own limits. Unlike the Chinese rocket misidentification, which was debunked relatively quickly through reverse image analysis and cross-referencing against known launch schedules, the Siberia-directed test claim hasn't been definitively debunked, only left unverified, a meaningfully different epistemic position. And the broader trajectory the DIA has assessed, Iran rapidly approaching genuine ICBM capability, a network of illicit technology transfer from North Korea and Russia, sustained investment stretching back over 2 decades, exists independently of whether this specific test succeeded exactly as claimed. Even if this particular launch turns out to be significantly exaggerated or entirely staged for its psychological effect, it sits inside a broader, independently verified trend line that Western intelligence has been tracking with increasing concern for years, a trend line this specific test, whatever its true outcome, was clearly designed to dramatize. Let's talk about why Russia's alleged approval for this specific test matters as much as the missile itself, because that detail, if accurate, represents a genuinely significant shift in how openly Moscow is willing to be associated with Iran's longer-range ambitions. Russia and Iran have deepened their defense cooperation considerably throughout this war, from reported S-400 deliveries to broader technology-sharing arrangements, but publicly approving a missile test explicitly aimed in Russia's own direction, toward Siberia, represents a level of visible coordination that goes beyond quiet technical assistance behind closed doors. If genuine, it suggests Moscow has calculated that openly associating itself with Iran's longer-range missile ambitions serves its own strategic interests, keeping Western attention and resources divided across multiple fronts, more than it fears the diplomatic cost of that association becoming public. And let's also think through what this specific test means for how ordinary people, far outside any government's intelligence apparatus, should actually process a claim like this one. Most viewers encountering this story will see it exactly the way it initially spread. A dramatic video, an alarming headline, and very little of the surrounding context that separates a genuinely significant capability shift from a psychologically calculated piece of wartime theater. That gap between how quickly alarming footage spreads and how slowly independent verification actually catches up isn't unique to this specific test. It's become a defining feature of how this entire 6-month war has been covered and understood by audiences everywhere, a pattern this series has returned to repeatedly, whether discussing leaked diplomatic documents or fabricated satellite footage, and one that makes exactly this kind of careful, sourced breakdown more valuable than simply reacting to whatever claim is trending in the moment. It's worth pausing to explain, in plain terms, exactly why an ICBM test toward Russian territory would even be logistically sensible for Iran to attempt, because the geography here explains a detail that might otherwise seem strange. Iran lacks the kind of vast, sparsely populated, fully controlled territory needed to safely test a missile at genuine intercontinental range without either violating another country's airspace or risking the projectile landing somewhere politically catastrophic. Russia's Siberian territory offers exactly that kind of vast, remote testing corridor, assuming Moscow's cooperation, solving a practical problem that has likely constrained Iran's ability to conduct fully realistic long-range tests in the past. That logistical reality lends at least some credibility to the claim, independent of the video evidence alone, since it would represent a plausible solution to a genuine technical constraint Iran has faced for years. Let's tour how different regional and international audiences have reacted to this specific test claim, because the response tells you almost as much as the test itself. Israeli defense officials, already tracking Iran's broader missile rebuilding effort closely, have treated the claim with the same measured skepticism. Arms control analysts have applied, neither dismissing it outright nor treating it as confirmed operational capability, instead folding it into the broader, already concerning trend line their own intelligence services have been monitoring. European governments, whose own territory would fall within range of the shorter 10,000-kilometer version of this claimed capability, have expressed renewed concern specifically about the pattern of repeated Iranian long-range tests, regardless of any single test's verified outcome, treating the trend itself as the more urgent signal. And within Iran, state media has predictably amplified the claim as evidence of the regime's resilience and technical sophistication, using it, much like the leaked peace deal we've covered previously, as a tool to shape domestic morale during an otherwise difficult period of economic hardship and infrastructure collapse. If this pattern feels familiar, it's because it mirrors almost exactly how North Korea handled its own long march toward confirmed ICBM capability over the previous decade. Pyongyang spent years mixing genuine technical progress with exaggerated claims and outright propaganda, making it consistently difficult for outside analysts to determine in real time exactly which specific tests represented meaningful capability advances, and which were primarily theater aimed at deterrence and domestic morale. It wasn't until years of accumulated independently verified tests that the international community reached confident consensus about where North Korea's program actually stood. Analysts studying Iran's current trajectory increasingly describe it as following a similar, deliberately ambiguous playbook, one where the fog surrounding any individual test claim may itself be a strategic asset, keeping adversaries uncertain and forced to plan for the worst-case interpretation, regardless of what's actually true underneath any single headline. One more angle worth adding before we bring this together, and it concerns what an operational long-range Iranian capability would actually mean strategically, even setting aside the question of whether this specific test succeeded. Possessing even a small, unreliable number of missiles, theoretically capable of reaching the American homeland, fundamentally changes the deterrence calculation surrounding any future American military action against Iran, regardless of how limited or technically imperfect that capability remains in practice. Nuclear strategists studying deterrence dynamics have long noted that even a marginal, unreliable long-range threat can shift an adversary's risk calculus disproportionately to its actual technical reliability, because no government wants to be the one that miscalculated the one time the capability actually worked. That asymmetry between Iran's real, verifiable capability and the psychological weight even an unverified claim carries in Washington's decision-making may be precisely the strategic effect this specific test, real or exaggerated, was always designed to produce. Before we go any further, it's worth being honest about exactly what remains unverified in this specific story, because a claim this significant deserves that clarity stated plainly. We don't know, with independent confirmation, whether the Siberia-directed missile actually traveled the claimed distance, whether it carried a genuine warhead representative payload, or whether the video that surfaced actually corresponds to this specific launch at all, rather than being repurposed footage, similar to the Chinese rocket misidentification just weeks earlier. What we can say with confidence is that this specific claim landed inside an independently documented, multi-year pattern of genuine Iranian investment in longer-range missile technology, tracked and assessed by American intelligence well before this test. A pattern real enough that the DIA has already built specific future stockpile projections around it, regardless of how this particular launch is eventually verified or debunked. So where does this actually go from here? If this specific test turns out, upon further scrutiny, to be significantly exaggerated or even fabricated for its psychological effect, similar to the debunked Chinese rocket footage circulating weeks earlier, it may end up remembered as one more entry in Iran's long history of overstated capability claims deployed specifically to complicate Western military calculations during a moment of genuine strike risk. That's a real, plausible outcome given the program's documented track record. But if independent verification eventually confirms even a portion of what Iran is claiming, a genuine, functional long-range capability, however limited or unreliable in its early form, it would represent the exact threshold DIA analysts have been warning was approaching, arriving considerably sooner than the agency's own 2035 projection anticipated, and forcing an immediate, fundamental reassessment of how every subsequent decision in the 6-month war gets made on every side. If you want to track where this specific capability question actually heads next, there are a handful of concrete signals worth watching, rather than reacting to the next dramatic headline alone. Watch for independent satellite imagery analysis of the Semnan launch site specifically, since commercial imagery providers have consistently proven capable of confirming or debunking Iranian test claims within days, exactly as happened with the Chinese rocket misidentification. Watch whether any debris or splashdown evidence emerges anywhere near Siberia in the weeks following this claim, since a genuine intercontinental range test would leave physical evidence considerably harder to fabricate than a single ambiguous video clip. And watch whether the Qasem Basir's optical guidance technology, the verified combat-tested capability sitting quietly behind this louder long-range headline, continues appearing in future Iranian strikes, since that steady, evidence-based technical progression may ultimately prove far more consequential than whatever the true story behind this specific Siberia claim turns out to be. One final detail worth sitting with before we close. Every element of tonight's story, the DIA's 2035 projection, the North Korean design lineage, the space program's dual-use technology transfer, the debunked Chinese rocket footage, the verified optical guidance breakthrough, was already scattered across defense trade publications, government threat assessments, and independent fact-checking organizations well before this specific Siberia claim went viral. None of it required classified access. It simply required tracing a single video back through the broader, years-long pattern it actually belongs to, rather than judging it entirely in isolation, the way most coverage of a moment like this inevitably does. Let's go back to where we started. Iran has test-fired missiles so many times that most of the world stopped paying attention, and then, without much warning, one single video changed the entire conversation. We told you this test broke the usual pattern, and everything we've walked through tonight explains exactly why. This isn't simply a story about one more Iranian missile claim to add to a long, often unreliable list. It's a story about a country that lost half its arsenal in a single devastating war, quietly rebuilding its production capacity in the shadows, while simultaneously testing a genuinely new precision guidance technology that's already proven capable of surviving real interception attempts and now, according to its own unverified claims, reaching toward a capability threshold Western intelligence had projected was still nearly a decade away. Whether this specific test was real, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated may matter less, in the end, than the trend line sitting underneath it, a trend line that every intelligence agency watching this war closely has already concluded is heading in exactly one direction. There's one last thought worth leaving you with before we close this out completely. Missile programs like this one rarely announce their true significance in a single dramatic moment, whatever the headlines around any individual test might suggest. They reveal it slowly across years of incremental engineering progress, quiet technology transfers, and a long trail of claims that range from genuinely significant to entirely fabricated, often impossible to fully separate from each other in real time. What matters most in the end may not be whether this specific missile actually reached Siberia as claimed, but whether the underlying trend line the DIA has already mapped out. 60 potential long-range missiles by 2035, a production base already rebuilding, a guidance technology already proven in combat, continues moving in the direction every independent assessment currently says it's heading. It's worth remembering, too, that this specific missile question doesn't exist separately from everything else shaping the 6-month war. A country simultaneously managing a strained, decapitated military leadership, a collapsing electricity grid, a persistently failing air defense network, and now a possible leap toward intercontinental missile capability, is a country whose every front, defensive and offensive, civilian and military, is under compounding pressure at once. Whether Tehran's leadership can genuinely sustain progress on this specific capability while everything else covered across this series continues straining under its own weight remains one of the more consequential open questions, shaping how and when this conflict ultimately concludes. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand what's actually different about this latest Iranian missile test, make sure to like this video and drop a comment so more people understand exactly what's at stake as this program keeps evolving. We'll be watching this story closely and we'll bring you the truth the moment anything changes.